My husband died, and within 3 months, my son decided who would eat dinner together in my own house. Nothing was said directly. But from that point on, I was no longer included in the ordinary hours of the day. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story has reached. The first sign was a calendar change I did not make. I noticed it on a Tuesday morning when I went into the kitchen to make tea and saw that the small wall calendar near the refrigerator had new handwriting on it. Not mine, neat, slightly slanted. Dinner times were written in. Not every day, but enough days that it looked intentional. 6 o'clock, 6:30, no names. I stood there longer than necessary. The kettle was already boiling and I tried to remember if I had agreed to anything. I couldn't recall a conversation. That felt strange because since my husband died, I had been careful to remember conversations, to replay them, as if they might be needed later. When my son and his wife moved in, they said it was temporary. They said it quickly, almost as a reflex, before I had even asked. I remember nodding because nodding was easier than speaking at that moment. And because the house had already begun to feel different without my husband's shoes by the door, they brought boxes and children and routines that did not wait for me to catch up. The rooms filled again, but not in the way they once had. There was movement, noise, a sense of schedule. I thought that meant company. The dinners started without me before I understood they had started at all. The first evening, I was upstairs sorting through paperwork from the hospital, still keeping everything in neat piles as if that mattered now. I came down at what had always been dinner time, the time my husband and I ate for 40 years. And the table was already cleared. Plates were in the dishwasher. A pot was still warm on the stove, the lid tilted slightly. My daughter-in-law said without turning around that there was food left and I could heat it whenever I wanted. She said it kindly, I think. At least it didn't sound unkind. I told her that was fine. I said it too quickly. After that, it repeated, not every night at first. Some nights I joined them, usually when my son specifically called up the stairs. Other nights I came down later and they were already done. The pattern formed quietly. There was no announcement, just a sense that the household ran on a different clock now, one that did not include waiting. What made it confusing was that nothing else seemed taken from me. I still lived in the house. My name was still on the mailbox. My chair was still by the window in the living room. The bills were still addressed to me. When people called, they still asked for me. On paper, I hadn't lost anything. That was part of what made it difficult to understand. Loss usually came with paperwork, or at least a clear moment. This didn't. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the utility company confirming that the account details had been updated. It listed my son's email address as the primary contact. My name was still there, but lower on the page. Secondary. I held the letter longer than necessary, then placed it with the others. I didn't mention it. There was no reason to, I told myself. It was practical, he was helping. The dinners continued to move earlier. 6 became 5:30, sometimes 5:15. The children were hungry after school, my daughter-in-law explained once as she passed me on the stairs. I nodded again. I began to eat later by default. I waited until the kitchen was quiet, until the sound of chairs scraping had stopped. I reheated what was left. I sat at the same table, but the room felt larger when I was alone. As if the walls had shifted slightly outward, I started noticing other small changes. The television volume was turned up earlier in the evening while I was still upstairs. The lights in the dining area were dimmed before I came down. Leftovers were placed in containers before I had seen the meal. None of these things were dramatic. They were efficient. They suggested a household that moved forward without pausing. Once I came into the kitchen at 4:30. Earlier than usual, I thought perhaps I would catch them before they sat down. My daughter-in-law looked surprised. She smiled, but her hands didn't stop moving. She said they were just about to eat. I stood there unsure where to position myself, and then she asked if I was hungry now or later. The question was neutral, but it assumed a choice I hadn't realized I was making. I said later. It seemed easier than rearranging what was already in motion. After that, I stopped trying to time it. I ate when the house settled. I listened to the dishwasher hum. I rinsed my plate carefully and placed it on the rack where there was space. In the morning, it was gone. The house itself hadn't changed much. The pictures were still on the walls. My husband's photograph was still on the mantel. but the daily rhythm had shifted. There was a sense of coordination I was no longer part of. School lunches were packed while I was still asleep. Weekend plans were discussed in low voices. I overheard only fragments. When I asked how everyone's day had been, the answers were brief. Already moving on. I noticed that when guests came over, my son introduced the house as our place now, then corrected himself, adding my name with a small laugh. The correction came quickly, but it lingered with me longer than the introduction. I told myself I was reading too much into it. People misspoke. Grief made one sensitive. One evening, I found a note on the counter reminding everyone to clean up after dinner because mornings were too rushed. The handwriting was the same as the calendar. I read it twice. The word everyone was underlined. I wondered if that included me or if it was simply a general instruction I happened to see. I washed my cup and put it away, then folded the note and placed it beside the sink. There were moments when someone would ask me a question. Usually practical. Did I know where a document was? Had I seen the spare charger? Was there more detergent? These questions didn't linger. They didn't invite conversation. They were resolved quickly and moved past. I answered them accurately. I was still useful in that way. At night, I lay awake listening to the house settle. Doors closed. Footsteps moved down the hallway. Laughter drifted up briefly, then stopped. I tried not to listen for my husband's breathing anymore. That habit was harder to break. The new sounds were different. They didn't include me, but they were close enough to remind me that I wasn't alone in the house. That distinction mattered, though I didn't yet know why. One morning, I came down early and found the breakfast table already cleared. The children had eaten and left. My son was gone. My daughter-in-law was loading the dishwasher. She said good morning, asked if I slept well. I said yes. She said there was coffee left. I poured myself a cup and sat down. The chair across from me was empty. I noticed crumbs on the placemat that weren't mine. Later that week, my son mentioned, almost casually, that it was easier for them to keep the kids on a schedule if dinners were earlier. He said it while standing, keys in his hand. I agreed. It made sense. He kissed my cheek before leaving. The contact was brief but familiar enough that it felt reassuring. I held on to that feeling longer than the conversation itself. Still, the pattern didn't change. If anything, it became more consistent. Consistency made it harder to question. It suggested a decision had already been made and integrated. I was discovering it after the fact. Through repetition rather than explanation. I began to set my own small routines. I made tea at the same time each evening. I chose programs to watch later when the television was free. I folded laundry slowly, carefully, even when it wasn't necessary. These actions filled the space between meals and sleep. They gave shape to time that otherwise felt unmarked. There was a formality to my interactions now, polite, efficient. When I spoke, people listened briefly. Their attention moved on quickly, as if there were other things waiting. I noticed myself pausing before speaking, deciding whether what I wanted to say required interruption. Often it didn't. Once I asked my daughter-in-law how her day had been. She answered while checking her phone. She said it was busy. She didn't ask about mine. I told myself she was tired. That was likely true. Still, I carried the unanswered question with me into the evening, setting it down only when I ate alone. The loss didn't feel sharp. It felt administrative, like a change in procedure no one thought to explain because it was obvious to everyone else. I was adjusting to it even as I was still trying to name it. At that stage, I couldn't have said what exactly had been taken. Only that something familiar no longer waited for me. Each night, the table was set without my place. Each night, it was cleared before I arrived. Each night, I reheated what remained. These were small things, ordinary things. They repeated enough that they began to feel permanent, though no one had said so. I told myself I was being patient, that families shifted after loss, that this was a season. I believed that because believing it allowed me to rest. It allowed me to stop looking for a moment when things would return to how they were. I didn't yet realize that what I was waiting for no longer existed. At the time, it simply felt like I was living in the same house, but slightly out of step with it. As if I had missed a cue I was supposed to catch. I assumed it would be explained eventually. I assumed there would be a moment when it made sense. That moment didn't come. Instead, the days continued orderly and full, and I moved through them quietly, still present, still necessary in small ways. but no longer part of the shared hours that defined family life. The loss had already settled in practical, unremarked, long before I understood what it meant. Before my husband died, the house moved at a pace that felt agreed upon, even when no one talked about it. We didn't need calendars on the wall to tell us when to sit down. Dinner happened when the light outside softened and the day was done enough to put away. It was never exact, but it was shared. My husband used to come into the kitchen while I was cooking, not to help exactly, just to stand near the counter and tell me small things that had happened during the day. He'd mention a neighbor he ran into or a problem with the car that wasn't urgent yet. Sometimes he'd open the fridge and then close it again, as if checking on progress. I learned the sound of his steps as he moved between rooms. They were unhurried, they belonged. When our son was younger, still living at home, dinner had been noisy in a different way. Chairs scraped. Homework was discussed badly. Plates were passed back and forth without much care. Even then, there was a sense of arrival to it. A feeling that the day paused there. When our son moved out, that noise left with him. But the pause remained. My husband and I kept it, even when it was just the two of us. In those years, dinner became simpler. We ate the same things more often. We talked less, but not because there was nothing to say. Silence wasn't absence, it was comfortable. If one of us spoke, the other was already listening. That mattered more than the words. After my husband retired, the timing shifted slightly, but again, together. Some days we ate earlier. Some days later, if I was tired, he noticed. If he was distracted, I waited. There was no discussion about it. The rhythm adjusted itself around us. When he got sick, that rhythm tightened. Meals became more deliberate. I paid attention to what he could eat, how much, how quickly. I sat longer at the table even after he was finished because leaving too soon felt wrong. Sometimes we didn't talk at all. Sometimes we talked about nothing important. Those dinners felt heavy, but they were still ours. In the weeks after he died, I kept setting the table for two, not consciously at first. My hands moved the way they always had. I'd catch myself only when I reached for the second glass. I stopped doing that eventually. But it took effort. The table looked bare with one place. I didn't change it. I let it look that way. When my son called to say they wanted to come stay for a while, I was sitting at that same table. The house was quiet. His voice filled the room in a way that felt comforting at first. He said they were worried about me being alone. He said it would be good for the kids to be around family. I agreed before he finished explaining. It seemed reasonable. It seemed kind. The day they arrived, the house filled quickly. Shoes by the door again, bags on the floor, the refrigerator opening and closing more often. I noticed my daughter-in-law rearranging shelves to make room. She asked me where things went. I told her, though some of it hadn't mattered before. We found places for everything. The first few dinners together were awkward but intentional. We sat down at the table at the usual time. The children fidgeted. My son talked more than usual, filling gaps. My daughter-in-law asked me questions about the house, about what my husband had liked to eat. I answered carefully. I wanted to get it right. Those evenings were tiring, but they felt like effort in the right direction. I remember one night in particular, early on. The children left half their food and were excused. My son stayed at the table with me. He asked how I was sleeping. I told him the truth, that I was sleeping lightly. He nodded, said it would get better. I didn't know if he was reassuring me or himself. At the time, it didn't matter. There was an understanding then that we were all adjusting. Nothing felt fixed. If dinner ran late, it ran late. If someone wasn't hungry, we waited. I assumed this flexibility would continue. I assumed we were finding a new shared rhythm. Even the practical changes felt shared at first. My son helped with paperwork he asked before making calls. We sat together at the table to go through bills. When something needed updating, he explained why. I listened. I agreed. It felt collaborative even when I didn't fully follow every detail. The house during those first weeks felt full. Different from before, but not unwelcome. Noise at unexpected times. Toys where there hadn't been toys in decades. I adjusted my movements to avoid stepping on things. I didn't mind. It gave me something to focus on. I still cooked most evenings then. My daughter-in-law offered to help. I said I was used to it. That was true. I was also not ready to let go of that role. Cooking had structure. It marked the day. When everyone sat down, I felt anchored. I noticed even then that the children were hungry earlier. Snacks appeared in the afternoon. My daughter-in-law checked the clock more often. She mentioned school schedules. I nodded. I said we could adjust. That seemed reasonable too. What I didn't notice or didn't want to notice was how quickly adjustments settled into decisions. At the time, everything still felt provisional, temporary. We were all still being careful with each other. When I think back now, there were small signs, plates being cleared a little faster, conversations shortening once the children finished eating, my son standing up before I had. None of it felt like exclusion. It felt like logistics. Before, dinner had been the center of the day. Not because of the food, but because of the stopping. Because of the agreement that whatever else was happening would wait. I didn't realize how much of my place in the family lived in that pause. At the time, I thought life was simply reorganizing itself after loss. I thought my role would shift but remain visible. I believed that because it made sense. Families adapt, that's what they do. I could still picture those early dinners clearly. Everyone present, the table full. The sense that we were doing this together, that picture stayed with me even as the reality moved away from it. I held on to it longer than I should have, using it as reference for what I assumed we were still working toward. I didn't yet understand that what I was remembering wasn't a stage on the way forward, but the last version of something that had already begun to disappear. At first, I thought the earlier dinners were temporary, something tied to the children adjusting, or the first few months of being back in the house. That belief allowed me to treat each evening as an exception rather than a pattern. I waited for it to correct itself. It didn't. The change repeated in ways that were easy to miss if you weren't the one standing just outside of it. Dinner happened earlier, then earlier again. Until the time itself stopped meaning much to me, what mattered was that it happened without me, more often than not. I would hear the sounds before I saw anything. Plates touching the counter, the clatter of cutlery, the brief, high voices of the children. Those sounds drifted up the stairs while I was still in my room, folding clothes or sorting through papers that no longer needed sorting. I told myself I would go down in a minute. By the time I did, the kitchen had already moved on. Some evenings, I stood at the top of the stairs and listened long enough to know whether it was worth going down yet. If I heard chairs being pushed back, I waited. If the voices were still gathered, I hesitated. That hesitation became familiar. It wasn't a decision exactly, more like a calculation. When I did arrive mid-meal, there was always a brief pause, not a dramatic one. Just enough for someone to look up and register that I was there. My daughter-in-law would ask if I wanted a plate. My son would say they'd just started. The children kept eating. I would say I'd eat later. That answer came out smoothly as if it had been practiced. Over time, no one asked anymore. A plate was left on the stove. Sometimes it was covered. Sometimes it wasn't. I learned which containers held dinner and which held leftovers from the night before. I learned not to disturb the arrangement until everyone was done. The repetition extended beyond meals. The dishwasher was run before I ate. The trash was taken out before I cleared my plate. The lights in the dining area were turned off while I was still sitting at the table. None of this was intentional, I told myself. It was simply efficient. The house had found a rhythm and I was no longer central to it. I began to notice how often plans were made in passing. A weekend outing mentioned as someone walked through the room. A grocery run decided while I was in another part of the house. I learned about these plans after they had already happened, usually when someone mentioned them casually later. When I asked where everyone was going one Saturday morning, my son said they'd talked about it the night before. I nodded, even though I'd been in the house that entire evening. The conversation simply hadn't included me. There were still moments when I was invited. Holidays, birthdays, events that required acknowledgement. Those occasions were marked clearly. They had start times, expectations. Everyday life didn't. Everyday life happened without notice. The children adjusted faster than anyone else. They stopped looking for me at the table, stopped asking where I was. When they saw me later, they said goodnight as if the day had already ended. I returned the greeting. It felt appropriate, even if I was just beginning my own evening. I tried once to sit down with them earlier without announcing it. I arrived in the kitchen just as food was being served. I took a chair, reached for a plate. No one objected. No one moved to include me either. The conversation continued around me, directed at the children. I ate quietly. When I finished, I stood up and cleared my place. No one noticed I had left. After that, I returned to eating later. It was simpler. It required less adjustment from everyone else. The repetition created its own logic. If I always ate later, it made sense to plan without me. If plans were made without me, it made sense that I would eat later. The cycle reinforced itself without anyone needing to say anything. Administrative changes followed the same pattern. Bills were paid before I saw them. Appointments were scheduled and added to calendars I didn't check. When I asked about something, the answer was always that it had already been taken care of. I thanked them. That seemed like the correct response. The house remained full. Activity from morning until night, yet my interactions grew shorter, more functional. I was consulted when necessary, informed when convenient. I noticed myself speaking less, choosing words that didn't slow anything down. Some evenings, I prepared my food while the table was still warm from earlier. The chairs were slightly out of place. A napkin folded differently than I remembered. These details repeated often enough that I began to expect them. They told me where I stood without requiring explanation. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel surprised anymore either. The repetition had flattened those reactions. What remained was a steady awareness that my presence was no longer assumed in the ordinary flow of the household. Each night as I ate alone, I told myself this was simply how things were now, that families changed, that roles shifted. The repetition made that belief easier to hold. It also made it harder to question. By the time I noticed how complete the pattern had become, it no longer felt new enough to address. It felt established, like something I had already agreed to, even though I couldn't remember doing so. The change didn't announce itself once. It announced itself every day in the same small ways, until it no longer felt like a change at all, but a rule I had learned by watching rather than being told. There was a point when the repetition stopped feeling external and began to settle inside me. That was when it became harder to tell whether the separation was something being done or something I was maintaining. That was when I started paying attention to my own movements. I noticed how often I waited before leaving my room, listening first, measuring sound and silence. I noticed how naturally I adjusted my pace to avoid intersecting with theirs. These weren't conscious decisions. They were small corrections made in advance, meant to keep things smooth. When I did speak, I chose moments that wouldn't interrupt anything. I timed my questions carefully. If someone looked busy, I held them. If someone looked distracted, I let them go. By the time an opening appeared, the question often felt unnecessary. I told myself this was consideration. That word sounded better than what it might have been otherwise. Sometimes, standing in the hallway, I felt the urge to say something simple, to ask if they wanted to eat together, to mention that I missed sitting at the table. The words formed briefly, then dissolved. I could imagine the response too easily. Not rejection exactly, adjustment, explanations, schedules, reasonable answers that would make my request feel inconvenient rather than important. I didn't want to be inconvenient. That thought surprised me the first time it occurred. I had spent most of my life being central without trying to be. Meals had waited for me because that was how households worked. Children had been hungry, schedules tight, but dinner still happened when I was ready. That hadn't required negotiation. It had been understood. Now understanding felt conditional. I began to question my own expectations. Was I holding on to something outdated? Was I confusing habit with entitlement? The world changed. Families changed. My son had his own family now. That was how it was supposed to be. Yet the thought didn't settle me. It hovered, unresolved. There were evenings when I deliberately stayed upstairs longer than necessary, as if testing something. I waited until I was sure dinner would be finished before going down. When I did, the kitchen was quiet. Orderly, food set aside, everything worked. No one came looking for me. That absence of disruption felt like confirmation, though I wasn't sure of what. Other nights, I went down earlier than usual, without a plan. I stood near the counter, unsure where to place myself. Those moments were uncomfortable in a way that didn't have language. No one told me to leave. No one asked me to stay. The uncertainty lingered longer than the interaction itself. I began to feel as though my presence required explanation. Even to myself, if I sat down early, I wondered what I was interrupting. If I waited, I wondered what I was conceding. Neither option felt neutral anymore. There were times when I thought about my husband. how this would have been different if he were still here. Not because he would have confronted anyone, but because the household would have organized itself around two people instead of one. Together, we had occupied space without apology. Alone, I felt the need to justify it. That realization unsettled me more than the silence. I caught myself minimizing things before anyone else could, saying I wasn't very hungry anyway, saying I preferred eating later. These statements were technically true, but they were also convenient. They relieved others of the need to consider me. They relieved me of the need to ask. I didn't know when accommodation turned into erasure. I only knew that it happened quietly through cooperation rather than conflict. Some days I told myself I was choosing this, that I liked the quiet, that eating alone gave me time to think. Other days that explanation felt thin. It worked only as long as I didn't examine it too closely. I wondered briefly whether I was being left out or whether I was stepping aside. The difference mattered. I couldn't yet say why. I only knew that acknowledging either possibility would require action, and I wasn't sure which action would be appropriate. I had always believed that if something was important, it would make itself clear, that it would announce itself through conflict or necessity. This situation did neither. It stayed mild, reasonable, easy to explain away. That made it harder to trust my own discomfort. At night, lying awake, I replayed small interactions, not looking for fault, looking for clarity. Had anyone actually excluded me? Had I actually asked to be included? The answers were unsatisfying. They left too much space in between. What troubled me most wasn't the loneliness itself, though it was there, steady, quiet. It was the sense that I was participating in my own disappearance without fully agreeing to it. That I was learning a new role by practicing it daily, even as part of me resisted the lesson. I told myself I would understand it eventually, that there would be a moment when it resolved into something definite. Until then, I continued as I had been, adjusting slightly each day, carrying the question without naming it, and hoping that silence would eventually clarify itself. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces, small ones. On their own, they didn't seem important. For a while, I didn't connect them. I treated each one as something to notice and move past. One evening, I went into the kitchen earlier than usual because I had nothing else to do. The house was already active. My daughter-in-law was cooking. The children were at the table, notebooks open, half working, half talking. My son stood near the counter looking at his phone. No one acknowledged my arrival right away. I stood there long enough to notice the table. It was set for 4. There was space at the end, but no plate. I could have taken one from the cabinet. I knew where they were. Instead, I waited, not consciously. Waiting had just become familiar. After a moment, my daughter-in-law noticed me. She asked if I needed something. The question was open. Neutral. I said no. That answer surprised me even as I said it. I stood there another moment, then left the room. Later, when I ate alone, I remembered that question. Not the words, the shape of it. It wasn't an invitation. It was an offer of assistance. I realized then those weren't the same thing. Another time, I overheard my son on the phone. He was explaining the household schedule. He spoke confidently, listing times, routines. He didn't mention me, not because he was avoiding it, but because it didn't occur to him. I listened from the hallway. I was holding a folded towel. And something settled. The explanation made sense without me. That was when I began to understand my absence was no longer a gap. It was part of the structure. I noticed how often decisions were made with efficiency as the guide. Earlier dinners. Faster mornings, clear schedules. I wasn't an obstacle to these things, but I wasn't necessary to them either. The household functioned whether I was present or not. That fact had been established through repetition, not discussion. One afternoon, a package arrived, addressed to my son. Inside were new storage containers for the kitchen. He and his wife unpacked them together. They rearranged cabinets. I watched from the doorway as they decided where everything should go. No one asked my opinion. When they were done, the kitchen looked neat, organized, unfamiliar. Later, I opened a cabinet and had to search for a bowl. That moment stayed with me longer than it should have. Not because of the bowls, but because of what it confirmed. The house was still mine in name, but its daily decisions no longer passed through me. The realization sharpened one evening. My daughter-in-law asked me casually if I preferred eating later anyway. She said it as if confirming a known fact. I hesitated too long. She filled the silence, said it seemed to work well for everyone. I agreed. That agreement landed with more weight than I expected. That night, sitting alone at the table, I understood something. The question was no longer whether they should include me. It had shifted. The question was whether there was any reason to change what was already working. I replayed the earlier weeks, looking for a moment when this could have gone differently. I couldn't find one. There was no clear turning point, no decision to point to. Just a gradual alignment of routines that placed me outside the center. What made the realization quiet rather than sharp was that nothing about it was cruel. No one was angry. No one was unkind. That absence of malice made it harder to protest. It framed everything as natural, even reasonable. I began to see my role more clearly. I was the person who lived upstairs, the person who ate later, the person whose presence was acknowledged but not anticipated. I fit into the household as a fixed variable, not a moving part. This understanding didn't upset me immediately. It settled slowly. Like something heavy being set down after a long carry, there was relief in seeing the shape of it. Confusion requires energy. Clarity, even unwelcome clarity, allows the body to rest. I stopped waiting at the top of the stairs. I stopped listening for cues. I accepted that dinner would happen without reference to me. When I came down later, I moved through the kitchen with familiarity, but without expectation. The quiet realization was this: I hadn't been forgotten. I had been reorganized. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. Every small procedural moment confirmed it. Every unasked question. Every meal prepared without a place for me. These weren't oversights. They were consistent with the role I now occupied. I didn't feel the need to explain this to anyone. There was nothing to explain. The structure spoke for itself, and in that recognition, something in me shifted. From waiting to observing, from hoping to noticing, the loneliness didn't change. It stayed steady, but it was no longer tangled with uncertainty. It had a context now. I understood where I stood, even if I didn't yet know what I would do with that understanding. The decision didn't arrive as a declaration, not even to myself. It formed gradually through small adjustments that felt practical rather than deliberate. I didn't sit down and decide anything would change. I simply stopped doing certain things. I stopped timing my evenings around the household. I no longer tried to predict when dinner would happen or whether I might intersect with it. I ate when I was hungry, even if that meant preparing something separate instead of reheating what had been left. Sometimes I cooked for myself while the house was still busy. Sometimes I waited until it was quiet. The difference was I no longer treated either option as provisional. I stopped keeping track of how often I was included. That tally had been exhausting. It required attention to absences, to pauses, to moments when something didn't happen. Letting it go felt like putting down an object I'd been carrying without realizing how heavy it was. One evening, I went to the grocery store alone. I bought food I knew no one else in the house particularly liked. Not out of spite, just because I could. I placed those items on a shelf in the refrigerator, one that had remained mostly untouched. When I opened the door later, they were still there, exactly where I'd left them. I began spending more time in parts of the house that weren't central. The spare room, the small back porch, places that didn't require coordination. I brought a chair outside in the late afternoon and sat there until the light changed. No one came looking for me. That confirmed what I already knew, but it also made the choice feel cleaner. I adjusted my sleep slightly. Some nights I went to bed earlier. Other nights I stayed up later, the television volume low. These were minor changes, but they were mine. They didn't need to align with anyone else. There was a moment small enough to overlook when my daughter-in-law asked if I'd be home for dinner the next evening. The question surprised me. I realized then I hadn't been assumed either way. I said I wasn't sure. The answer felt honest. It also felt like a boundary, though I didn't name it. After that, I stopped explaining myself. If I was asked where I'd been, I answered simply. If I wasn't asked, I didn't volunteer anything. My presence became consistent but quieter. I didn't withdraw completely. I just stopped orienting myself around their schedule. I noticed this shift didn't create disruption. No one commented on it. Meals continued as before. Plans were still made efficiently. The household absorbed my change the same way it had absorbed my absence earlier. That lack of reaction confirmed something. The decision was internal, not relational. I wasn't changing the family. I was changing how I occupied it. I stopped waiting for recognition that might not come. I stopped rehearsing conversations I had no intention of starting. These weren't acts of resignation. They were acts of conservation. I was preserving what little energy I had by no longer spending it on situations that didn't respond. Some evenings I ate in my room, not because I was hiding, because it was quieter. I carried the plate carefully, placed it on a tray I found in the closet. I ate slowly. When I was done, I washed everything and put it away. No one noticed the difference. The decision settled fully one night when I realized I was no longer hoping for an invitation. The thought simply didn't arise. That absence felt significant. It meant something had ended, even though nothing had been said. I didn't announce this shift to anyone. There was no need. It existed entirely in how I moved through the days, in what I expected and what I didn't. It was a decision made without language, but it shaped everything that followed. The consequences weren't immediate, not in any dramatic way. They unfolded slowly through the same quiet procedures that had shaped everything else. Nothing collapsed. Nothing was corrected. Life continued, adjusted slightly around the space I now occupied. Once I stopped orienting myself around the household, my absence became more consistent. I was no longer half-present. No longer hovering at the edges of shared routines. I was either there deliberately or not there at all. That clarity simplified things for everyone. Even though no one said so, dinners continued earlier. The table was set. Cleared efficiently, I no longer wondered whether a place might appear for me. When I came into the kitchen later, the arrangement was familiar. Food set aside, counters wiped, lights dimmed. I moved through the space without hesitation, as if it had always been this way. The children adjusted without difficulty. They greeted me when they saw me, but they didn't look for me anymore. Their days were structured: school, activities. Bedtime, I fit into those days as a background presence, like a room they passed through rather than stopped in. My son spoke to me less, not unkindly. Our conversations became practical. He updated me on things he thought I should know. He asked questions when decisions required my name or signature. Otherwise, he assumed I was fine. I let that assumption stand. My daughter-in-law seemed more comfortable, I think. She moved freely through the house. She made changes without checking first. When she asked my opinion, it was usually about something already decided. I answered briefly. That seemed to be enough. There were moments when I realized how complete the shift had become. One afternoon, I came home from an appointment. The house was empty. A note sat on the counter. They'd gone out for dinner. They'd be back later. No explanation beyond that. I read the note, folded it, placed it where I always placed things meant for me. I made myself something to eat. I sat down. The house was quiet. I noticed I didn't wait for the sound of the door. When it came later, it didn't interrupt anything I was doing. Administrative consequences followed too. Mail addressed to me was placed neatly in a pile instead of handed to me. Messages were relayed instead of discussed. Decisions were communicated after the fact. I thanked them. That response closed the exchange. Efficiently, I became careful not to ask questions that might reopen something I had already adjusted to. When plans were mentioned casually, I didn't ask follow-ups. When holidays were discussed, I waited to be told what time to arrive rather than assuming I'd be there from the beginning. This arrangement reduced friction. It also reduced connection. There were days when I didn't speak to anyone until evening. When I did it, the conversation was brief. I answered questions. I acknowledged information. I didn't add much else. That restraint felt natural now. It matched the role I had learned. The consequence that surprised me most was how invisible my adjustment was. From the outside, nothing appeared wrong. A full house, a functioning family, everyone busy. My withdrawal fit neatly into that picture. It didn't disrupt it. That made it difficult to argue against. I noticed changes in myself too. I stopped telling stories that required context. I stopped sharing observations that might slow things down. I kept my thoughts contained. Not because I had nothing to say, but because there was nowhere for those thoughts to land. Even when I was present, I felt separate. Conversations happened over me rather than with me. I listened. Not because it was requested, but because it was assumed. That assumption carried weight. The loneliness stayed steady. It didn't intensify, it didn't recede. It became constant, low, predictable. Knowing what to expect removed hope along with uncertainty. By the time I noticed how little space I occupied in the family's emotional life, it felt too established to question. The consequences had already woven themselves into daily routines. Undoing them would have required disruption. And I was no longer certain disruption was justified. So the days continued. Efficient, orderly, quiet. And in that quiet, the cost of my decision became clear. Not all at once, but through the accumulation of ordinary moments that no longer reached me, and through the realization that no one was waiting for me to return to a place that had already been filled by something else. The aftermath didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a settling. The way dust does after something has been moved and placed somewhere new. Nothing announced itself as final. Nothing suggested it was temporary either. My days became quieter, not abruptly but consistently. I woke early, before the house fully started. I moved through the morning without crossing anyone's path. I made breakfast, cleaned up, all before the children came downstairs. When they did, they passed through the kitchen quickly, already focused on leaving. We exchanged brief greetings. That was enough to mark the day. I learned the shape of the house when it was empty, which rooms held warmth longer, which chairs caught the afternoon light. These details had always been there, but now they belonged to me alone. I sat with them, without trying to turn them into anything else. Meals were no longer events. They weren't something I oriented around, they were tasks. I ate when I needed to, what I preferred, without reference to anyone else's appetite. Sometimes I used the dining table, sometimes I didn't. The choice carried no expectation. When I was invited to something, a birthday dinner, a school event, a holiday, it was clear, specific. A time was given, a role implied. I arrived when told, I left when it seemed appropriate. These occasions felt formal, even when they were meant to be warm. They reminded me that inclusion now required structure. Between those occasions, I existed in the background of the family's life. Present in the house, but absent from its momentum. Conversations passed me by, decisions were made elsewhere. I was informed when necessary. The pattern held. I noticed I no longer imagined how things might change. The future didn't stretch forward with possibility that way. It looked like the present extended. That recognition didn't frighten me. It clarified something I'd been avoiding. There were moments, small, unexpected. A pang of what used to be. Laughter through the wall, the smell of a meal I wouldn't be part of. These moments didn't overwhelm me. They arrived, stayed briefly, then passed. I didn't chase them. I thought about my husband often, not with the sharpness of earlier grief. With a steady awareness, I understood now how much of my place in the family had existed alongside his. Together, we had been a unit, a presence that required recognition. Alone, I was easier to organize around. This understanding didn't lead to anger. It led to acceptance. Not comforting acceptance, but stable. I stopped expecting the house to hold me the way it once had. I stopped measuring my worth by how often I was included in its rhythms. Over time, I began to invest more attention outside the family. Small things, conversations with neighbors, longer visits to the library, sitting in public places where my presence didn't need explanation. These moments didn't replace what I'd lost, but they balanced it. Slightly, inside the house, my role didn't change. I was respected. I was cared for in practical ways, but I wasn't central. That distinction stayed clear. What I carried forward wasn't grievance. It was knowledge. I understood how quietly a place could be lost, not through conflict, not through cruelty, but through efficiency, through adaptation. I understood how easily a person could remain physically present while being moved out of the center of their own family. Nothing about this outcome was dramatic. It wouldn't have been obvious to anyone watching from the outside. But it shaped every ordinary day that followed. I continued to live in the same house. I continued to be part of the family, and yet my place within it had changed. In a way that didn't reverse itself, because it had never been announced to begin with.